Sarita Nair was appointed Chief Administrative Officer by Mayor Tim Keller in December 2017. And as CAO, Sarita is the city's top senior executive manager. She oversees all 19 departments of municipal government and nearly $1 billion budget. Sarita most recently served as the Office of the State Auditor's Chief Government Accountability Officer and General Counsel, where she successfully brought transparency and accountability to a variety of issues in state government, including addressing the statewide sexual assault evidence kit backlog, out-of-state contract spending, paid equity reporting, indigent health care funding, and state agency fund balances. In addition to having a successful career as a lawyer, Sarita has also worked in the field of international development. Originally from Pittsburgh, Sarita is active in the community, having served here in Albuquerque, having served on the boards of many nonprofits and legal groups. Her daughter attends New Mexico State University, and one of my favorite pieces, that she's a fellow dog lover, and has a Great Dane boxer mix, which I want to see photos, that's all I'm saying. Great Dane boxer mix. But most of all, I just want to say that Sarita is a tireless advocate for racial equity here in the city of Albuquerque, pushing the city to genuinely live into its values. So thank you for that. And welcome.
My name is Sarita Nair. I have the privilege of serving as the Chief Administrative Officer for this city. And I get the rare treat of being able to introduce our Mayor, Tim Keller. And I say that's rare because we are very rarely in the same place at the same time in front of a group. We try to divide and conquer all the great things going on in our city. And the fact that we are both here reflects how much we value and appreciate the work that GARE does and the work that all of you in this room do, and also how grateful we are that you chose Albuquerque as your gathering place for this year. So thank you so much for that. I also want to give a quick shout out to our MCs, Eric Riego and Kristen Chavez-Smith. I don't know where they went. I can't see anything up here. There they are. So Eric might not have told you that he was a former state senator and a former city councilor, but we get the pleasure of sort of bringing into the dock a lot of boats that he set into the water a long time ago that have to do with racial equity and social justice in the city. And Kristen is the driving force, and I really mean, she's like the locomotive engine behind all of our youth programs, our One Albuquerque Youth Connect group. So can we give those two another round of applause? So now I get to introduce Mayor Keller, and I'm going to walk around a little bit if that's okay. Mayor Keller was elected in 2017, and he spoke on the campaign trail about racial equity very expressly. And despite the history of this place, which some of you got to hear about last night, I don't remember another mayoral campaign ever directly centering issues of equity and inclusion as long as I've been in the city. And so when he won by a considerable margin, to me that reflected both sort of the values of our community and how important equity is to us, but also that we're so ready for change. We were really ready for this work to be done. So when we got here, of course, this is sort of at the top of the agenda and the first thing on many of our lists. And Mayor Keller always takes a multifaceted approach to everything that we do. So he has definitely led policy initiatives. For example, we changed the criteria for how we prioritize capital projects to include consideration of historically underserved neighborhoods, adding that criteria in for the first time. And it wasn't as easy as we thought it was going to be. And then we also, he also transformed the American Indian Commission to make it more representative of our neighbors and to recognize the true government-to-government relationship that we have with the pueblos and the tribes that surround us. For the first time that really any American city has done He's also understands the power of structural change, and I think one of the biggest things that he led in that respect was creating our Office of Equity and Inclusion. And he had the foresight to appoint Michelle Melendez, who many of you got to meet. Stand up, Michelle. She's an amazing public health practitioner, community organizer, former journalist, but not just to appoint her, but also to put some real data and analytic power in the office with our Deputy Director, Brittany Ortiz, and some real amazing sort of street level organizing power with Mariela Ruiz-Angel and Don Begay, who are also here. Hopefully you'll get to meet them all. But what I think is unique about Mayor Keller's approach is his understanding of how to really drive that change all the way into the nooks and crannies of government. And let me give you an example. We walked into an existing contract to change over the streetlights in our city. So to transform them from the old yellow ones to the LED bulbs. And that contract was already in place. The replacements had already started, but we were still hearing, especially from communities of color, that they weren't seeing the changes. They weren't getting the new lights yet. So he called the meeting and he asked the folks who were working on that project to explain the sequencing and how that replacement was occurring. And it all sort of made common sense how they were doing it, because cities finance these projects through the electric bill savings that they get, right? So you save money on your electric bill, you devote it to paying off the project. So from that perspective, it made sense to replace the highest wattage bulbs first, and then they moved into the areas next to that, and then they did the rest of the city. But what happened as a result of that, just because of the way the map worked, is that communities of color were pretty much systematically going to be last on the list to get their streetlights replaced. Because, as everybody in this room knows, right, we live in a deep context of institutional and structural racism and injustice, so even neutral policies tend to reinforce those structures. But Mayor Keller also understands that. So what he did was actually sit down with the people who were implementing that project in a map and draw circles block by block around the lights that we thought should be changed first. And just actually reallocated those resources, literally streetlight by streetlight, which was just amazing. I'd never seen anyone do anything like that before, but I have seen it many times since. So there are many times when you will see him on the 11th floor, which is what we call the mayor's office, with a map and a table full of professionals, explaining why we need to reallocate resources into communities that have not historically gotten them. And it's been everything from medians to Americans with Disability Acts improvements. And here's what happens when you have the mayor having those conversations. About the third or fourth time that you get called up from your line department to come up to the mayor's office with a set of maps, you really want to get it right. You don't want to have that same conversation again. And so you make sure that you, when you're planning the project in the first place, are thinking about equity, and you're thinking about the land use and racial history of our city. And then, because you don't really want to mess it up, you start writing it into your checklists and into your procedures. And we're all good bureaucrats here, right? We know when something is in a checklist or a procedure, it becomes harder to stop doing it than to keep doing it. And that is how you create true, lasting change in an institution. And Mayor Keller does not hesitate to use both his personal time and his political capital to create that level of change. And that's why it is my honor to serve as his CAO and also to introduce Mayor Tim Keller.
Well, good morning. I heard earlier that someone, probably Eric Griego, taught you how to say our alternative name, Burke. So we like to say, good morning, Burke. It's great to see each and every one of you. And I want to thank our CAO for that tremendous intro. She's often much more articulate than me, and in many ways, too, all of the change that she mentioned, it's a partnership. And so it's something that my executive team and the individuals she introduced, we feed off of each other's prioritization and energy for race equity work. And it really is an outstanding environment to work in because of that. And so I want to thank her for driving all of that change that she just articulated as well. And also, since we are in Albuquerque, I do want to ask all our city employees who are here, I know there's quite a bit, stand up, give us a wave, quick stand up. I know there's a lot over there. Thank you for all you do for the city of Albuquerque. Now, I also want to thank, I see a lot of folks in the room that I recognize, perhaps from one-off conferences gone by, also from different nonprofits that you work with, and some in the GARE community that I met with in LA. And I want to thank each and every one of you, not only for the work that you do, that's so important, but also for teaching me. I think as a lot of people in America and even around the world who grew up not racially aware, right? With all of that bias and privilege that comes with an environment that I grew up in, running on a platform of equity and inclusion was a learned behavior, right? It is something that I was taught from almost everyone in this room and that I've been taught in many aspects of my adult life. And I think that's a very important thing because I believe that it is just one slice of everything that we have to accomplish. But that piece, for me personally, is because of many of you in this room. So thank you for teaching me everything that we discussed here today. Thank you so much for making me a better person, a better American, and a better mayor of Albuquerque. Thank you. Now for me, a couple of things that I think I have learned from many of these discussions and that I continue to learn. Firstly, I want to acknowledge our national context. I'm sure we've talked a lot about this. And I think what we heard in the beginning actually about the hope that I now see in America is very important. Of course, we are in an environment where, unfortunately, look, racism and hatred have become sort of, in some way, part of the dialogue all of a sudden, whether it's on Twitter or not. This is a terrible thing for our country. And I also know that the other side of that is also happening. And that's what we heard about earlier, which is that I believe that racial awareness, racial healing, the concept of racial equity is equally increasing in national dialogue and at a greater rate. And that's why I like to remind folks, even though we're not supposed to be too political, that 2020 is coming. And so I have great faith that America is going to choose a much different path. Now, right here in New Mexico, I want to share with you a little bit about our path. And our path, I know you learned a lot about last night, those of you who were able to attend. And our path fundamentally is one of a city at a crossroads. And it's a crossroads that you can see visually when you walk outside of this convention center. You see a huge mountain on one side, you see a river, and then there's like a gap in the mountain that you can walk through. This is basically the crossroads of Albuquerque. It is a place where a river crossed a gateway to the plains and out west. This same crossroads has been the crossroads essentially repeatedly almost every century, if not in between, in our city's history. And it's left a very important stamp on who we are. And so this started with our Pueblo communities, people since time immemorial located here because of that trade route and also the confluence of the river for agrarian communities. Then it became the stopping place for El Camino Real, which was the road from Santa Fe, from Mexico City to Santa Fe, that came up through here in the Spanish conquest originally of New Mexico. And then you see this play out again and again. It was the Santa Fe Trail for sort of that Anglo invasion or whatever you want to call it. Then it was Route 66. This crossroads has continued to happen in our city's history. But at each step of this crossroads, it's amazing what has happened. We have actually kept and retained a lot of that cultural identity that I think in many ways often washes away in other parts in America or in other crossroads. We are very different, and you saw some of this last night. We like to use these terms like we didn't cross the border crossed us, which is true. We also know that for us terms, even the concept of we like to obviously use terms like people of color, but for us there's an older term people used to say, well, Albuquerque is a minority majority state or a city. That is really hard for us to understand because we have always been a majority people of color, always. That is a very special thing. Now, we still have tremendous challenges. Some of our challenges are the same challenges that we have all across America. But some of them are also a little bit different. And even in our leadership, in some ways we have one of the most diverse political leadership, I would argue, of any state in the country. We have a legacy of a of-color legislature, of governors of color, mayors of color, city council of color. We have been doing this for a long time. But yet, there are still these same kinds of barriers we see in other places, especially when it comes to areas around our US Senate, for example. I won't go into detail about our different levels of representation, but we have the same challenges, yet different challenges. So for us, when I became mayor and started talking about, as Sarita mentioned, actually running on a platform of inclusion and of equity, first off, those terms were very much new to us. And I found myself either telling the story of the stools and the chairs and the counter or the fence to explain equity over and over again. Literally like 45 different mayoral debates. And I'd have to go to my parents and say, why are you always talking about equity and what's wrong with equality? And, you know, and I was like, that's amazing. Like, I'm so glad you asked me that question. So this, to me, became an amazing fulcrum point that Sarita mentioned for our community, where in many ways I would hear comments during the election like, Keller, you're all right, you know, I think I'm gonna vote for you. I don't know what you're talking about in terms of inclusion and, you know, all this other stuff. And then they go, yeah, we're probably gonna vote for you. And then others, of course, like, finally we are inserting a vocabulary and a dialogue on these issues that we have not talked about for a long time. But I think inside there too is also, of course, this latent awareness that everyone has, where once we did have those discussions on TV every night in debate, in the paper, in conversation with each other, both for and against, because there were originally like 13 people running, so a lot of us were talking about this. And at the end of the day, I think people realized that, look, this is hopefully inclusion and equity is part of who we always have been in Albuquerque, and I'm very proud of that. I think that's something that people realize, you know what, in some ways, we've been doing this for a long time. But they also realize how far we have to go to shore up a huge host of issues in our city. And so some of those Sarita mentioned, I'm just gonna touch on a few of them, but what this actually means in reality, when we think about things like basic things like hiring, and this is like the most, this is like 1970s style, you know, in some ways, equity work. If we think about hiring in the city of Albuquerque, we have the same problem everyone else does in many ways, which is that, you know, whether it's through a computer database or for a form, you're required to have a prerequisite, but if you don't have that prerequisite years of experience or that specific degree, you can't get in the door. And of course, if certain communities of color haven't been in the door before, they're never gonna get in the door, right? We face this literally, and to Sarita's point, we have to drive this deep down into bureaucracy. We have to like recode our HR system. This is what you're gonna hear a little bit about too. But I will tell you this, if you don't do that, it's just a speech. It's just a press release. It's just a talking point. It's just a debate. It actually takes real work. And sometimes it's actually kind of boring work. Like restructuring an HR database is not the most exciting thing to do. But you have to do it. And it's the same thing with something like procurement. I wanted to increase the number of businesses of color that get contracts from the city, because even though we have, you know, this setup where we're basically, you know, a majority community of color, the contracts that go from the city, right, only something like 20% go to businesses of color. That doesn't make any sense. And that should never have been the case, but it is the case. But then there's barriers to that too. There's all these legal forms you have to fill out, and there's all these requirements you have to have. And if you haven't worked through that process before, which the incumbent companies have with their lawyers and accountants, you will never get that city contract. So now all of a sudden, we're realizing that change actually goes through, again, very boring things like the procurement code and things like this. But that is actually, I believe, what we have to do, to take things like research and data and turn them into action and turn them into results. That's what we're really focused on in our Office of Equity and Inclusion, and even in our Civil Rights Office. We're trying to understand how methodically we can actually demonstrate that we're doing this. And so in that contract example, this was such a challenge that we had something like 2,000 contracts the city lets out. Well, we don't even know necessarily the ethnic background of the recipient of those contracts because it wasn't asked for, right? So that's like a data question. But then if we ask for it, not everyone wants to give it, and that goes for businesses of color too. So, you know, then it's like, what do you do with this unknown, you can't ask that question kind of problem? And then you unpack all of this, and we decided, you know what? Forget the white paper. Forget the systematic change that we want to get to. Let's go 10 contracts at a time. So we try every month to have 10 contracts that we switch from an out-of-state company or a company that doesn't fit our minority or woman-owned business criteria, and we just try and switch it. And the idea is if we can just do 10 a month, like, we'll get there. And that kind of methodical, pragmatic approach, I hope, in the end, right, is going to accomplish the same thing, and we'll get to that system change. But we don't want to wait, and that's really what I want to leave you with, because I believe working on equity is an imperative now, and it's not just at the government level or at the private sector. It's not just about researching it. We've got to start demonstrating results, and that's what we're very, very committed to here in the city. Now, the last example I want to leave you with is, I know Kristen was up here earlier. You know, I also ran on that we should have more after-school programs for kids. This was, I ran on safety, inclusion, and kids, which isn't a revolutionary idea, but it is if you know that the city doesn't have anything to do with our school system. So, you know, each city is different. Our city, the school system is totally separate. And historically, the city kind of always been pointing the finger at the school system to like do more, et cetera, why can't you help our kids more? We said we're gonna own that responsibility. We are gonna try and do everything we can outside of the school day to help our kids. So that's after school programs and summer programs and early childhood development, especially in communities of need. Now, for us, when we try to do this, sometimes things are you know, so basic and convoluted that you almost can't even predict them. So in the idea to try and have more kids of color sign up for our spring break programs, we said, okay, you know, we're gonna use technology. And so we're gonna have an app where you can sign up and get your kid in these programs, right? Which sounded at the time like a great idea. What did that do, right? It skewed everyone who signed up for those programs because they fill up like within a day. It skewed it to everyone, right? One who has time during the day to like look at their cell phone, one who has a cell phone, one who already has their information stored so they can fill out the form online, right? This completely cut out essentially single parents who are working 2 jobs. So we ended up alienating the same demographic we were trying to help. And so these are the kinds of real-time learning lessons that I want to share with you. So we're trying to work on things small and things big, things exciting and things sometimes not so exciting. Now the last piece that I do want to share has a little bit to do with the streetlights that Sarita mentioned. In Albuquerque, I also believe that the budget, and I believe this is true in any case, no matter how you look at it, right, that budget is the expression of your community's values. Whether you want it to be or not, it is. It is the outcome of our democracy. And it's where we spend our tax dollars, right? So at least from a monetary perspective, that is the definition of what we're prioritizing. Well, historically, like a lot of places, I think we've been prioritizing where we put money in terms of roads, in terms of streetlights, in terms of medians, in terms of trees. We would divide it up equally, not equitably, equally among city council districts. Right. And that's pretty much how it usually works. You want to divide up so everyone in the city gets the same thing. But there again, you have the same problem. If certain communities didn't get the infrastructure they were supposed to in the first place, then they never get it. So we literally got our city council to agree to change that criteria to be based on communities of need or disenfranchised communities in ordinance. That is awesome. So we are now allocating our tax dollars, whether it's after school programs or whether it's literally the roads that we repave. We are finally repaving roads in neighborhoods that haven't had roads repaved in 50 years. That is ridiculous. And this, I believe, is what it takes. It takes all of us together. I had to convince council of that. They were very supportive. And now, as Sarita mentioned, we get out those maps all the time. And the first lens we look at is equity. And that's the way it should be. So I hope some of these stories might be relevant for you in your own work. I also am so excited because we've got a lot of folks from the city here who are excited to learn from each and every one of you and hear your stories and listen to your stories. And so thank you for time this morning for us to share ours with you. And thank you for choosing Albuquerque for this conference too. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.